It's been a long 6 weeks.
Phone numbers, addresses, employment records, financial information. Everything was fair game. Someone doxed Daniel Martel's elderly mother, posting her address and phone number with a suggestion that people call her to demand answers. The harassment got so bad that the 78-year-old woman had to disconnect her phone and stay with relatives. Caroline's sister, who had been providing emotional support during the worst period of her life, found her own family targeted. Her children's school photos were posted online with speculation about whether they were safe, with an aunt who was harboring a child killer. Even the investigating officers weren't spared. Detective Hartman's personal Facebook account was hacked, and fake posts were created suggesting she was covering up evidence. Staff Sergeant Davidson received death threats from people convinced he was part of a conspiracy to protect the real perpetrators. The online mob's favorite target was Daniel Martel. Amateur investigators had decided he was guilty based on their interpretation of his behavior, and they were determined to prove it through digital stalking. They found old social media posts from years before he met Caroline and twisted them into evidence of violent tendencies. They discovered he had been late on rent payments and presented this as proof he had killed the children for insurance money. There was no insurance money. They tracked down his ex-girlfriend from 5 years earlier and harassed her until she agreed to an interview where they pressured her to say negative things about him. "The internet destroyed my life," Daniel would later tell investigators. "People I've never met, who know nothing about me or my family, decided I was guilty and set out to ruin me. I couldn't go to the store without people recognizing me, couldn't get a job because employers had seen the online accusations. My own neighbors started avoiding me." But the online mob didn't limit their attention to the obvious suspects. They turned their investigative zeal on anyone tangentially connected to the case. Mark Thompson, the volunteer who found Lily's blanket, was accused of planting it himself for attention. His personal information was posted online, and he received hundreds of messages accusing him of being part of a cover-up. The postal worker who delivered the mysterious letters with children's drawings was followed home and photographed, with online sleuths suggesting he was somehow involved in their creation. Even Caroline's mother, a 65-year-old woman who lived in Ontario and hadn't seen her grandchildren in months, was accused of helping to hide the bodies. The most destructive aspect of the online investigation wasn't the harassment, it was the way it contaminated the real investigation. Police tip lines were flooded with leads generated by internet speculation. Investigators had to waste precious time and resources following up on theories that had no basis in reality but had gained traction online. "We received over 3,000 tips in the first month after the case went viral online," Staff Sergeant Davidson reported. Maybe a dozen of them were legitimate. The rest were people reporting their neighbors because they looked suspicious or calling in locations they'd seen discussed on Reddit. The online chaos also made it nearly impossible for investigators to keep certain details of the case confidential. Information that police needed to withhold to verify the credibility of potential witnesses or confessions was leaked and analyzed online within hours of being discovered. But perhaps most tragically, the internet mob's certainty about the family's guilt meant that other possibilities were barely explored. The online narrative became so focused on Daniel and Caroline as perpetrators that alternative theories, stranger abduction, involvement by someone outside the immediate family, even the possibility that the children were still alive somewhere, were dismissed as unrealistic. The digital lynch mob had decided on their villains, and no amount of actual evidence was going to change their minds. As summer turned to fall, the online attention began to wane. The amateur detectives moved on to newer cases, fresher mysteries, more recent tragedies to dissect and solve from their keyboards. But the damage they left behind was immeasurable. A family destroyed by speculation. An investigation compromised by false leads. A community divided between those who believed the online theories and those who recognized them as digital vigilantism at its worst. And somewhere in the wreckage of destroyed lives and conspiracy theories, 2 children remained missing, their fate no closer to being resolved despite the thousands of hours of amateur investigation that had been devoted to their case. The internet had promised to democratize justice, to give ordinary people the tools to solve crimes that stumped professionals. Instead, it had shown how dangerous amateur investigation could be when it was unrestrained by ethics, training, or basic human decency. The real investigation would have to continue despite the online chaos, not because of it. And investigators were beginning to realize that the truth about Lilly and Jack Sullivan might be buried so deep that no amount of digital digging would ever uncover it. Keep watching because what we discover next will make you question everything about how missing children cases are investigated in the digital age. If you're as disturbed by this online mob mentality as I am, let me know in the comments, and please hit that subscribe button so you don't miss when we uncover what really happened. By autumn 2025, 6 months after Lilly and Jack Sullivan vanished, the official investigation had reached a grim conclusion that no one wanted to acknowledge publicly. The children were most likely dead. The evidence was circumstantial but overwhelming. No verified sightings despite national media coverage. No DNA traces beyond their own home. No ransom demands. No credible communication from kidnappers. No signs of life anywhere in Canada or beyond. But determining that the children were dead was only the beginning of a much darker line of inquiry. If Lilly and Jack weren't lost in the woods, if they hadn't been taken by strangers, then what had happened to them? The answer that investigators were reluctantly beginning to consider was one that would haunt their dreams and challenge everything they thought they knew about the case. Detective Hartman sat in the task force meeting room, staring at a whiteboard covered with timeline details, suspect information, and evidence photos. After 6 months of investigation, the picture it painted was disturbing in its implications. "Let's walk through what we know," she said to the assembled investigators. 2 children disappear during a narrow window when their mother is outside. The stepfather claims to have been asleep, but doesn't hear them leave through a door that makes audible noise. The mother and stepfather have been having relationship problems. Financial stress is mounting. There's evidence of domestic discord. She paused, letting the implications sink in. Then we have the planted evidence. The shirt found miles away, forensically clean. The blanket discovered in a previously searched area, also clean. The letters with children's drawings that may or may not be authentic. Someone is actively trying to mislead this investigation. Detective Morrison, who had been silent through most of the meeting, finally spoke. "You're talking about family involvement." Hartman nodded grimly. "I'm talking about the possibility that what happened to these children happened inside their own home, and everything since then has been an elaborate cover-up." The theory was supported by more than just suspicious behavior. Forensic analysis of the Sullivan trailer had revealed troubling details that hadn't been released to the public. Luminol testing had detected traces of blood in the children's bedroom, not large amounts, but more than you'd expect from normal childhood injuries. The blood was confirmed through DNA testing to belong to both Lilly and Jack, but it was impossible to determine when it had been shed. More disturbing were the inconsistencies in the physical evidence. The children's pajamas, which Caroline claimed they had been wearing when she last saw them, were found in their bedroom dresser, clean and folded. If the children had been wearing these clothes when they disappeared, how had they ended up back in the drawer? When confronted with this evidence, Daniel claimed the children had changed into different clothes before going outside. But Caroline insisted they had still been in their pajamas when she left to feed the chickens. Someone was lying about basic facts, and those lies were starting to form a pattern that investigators couldn't ignore. Dr. Sarah Chin, the forensic psychologist consulting on the case, presented a profile that was chilling in its implications. "We're looking at someone who is organized, methodical, and capable of long-term deception," she explained. "The planted evidence shows planning and premeditation. This isn't someone who acted in a moment of rage and then panicked. This is someone who has been carefully managing the narrative of this case from the beginning." The psychological profile suggested someone with intimate knowledge of police procedures, someone who understood how investigations worked and how to manipulate them. It also suggested someone who felt they had successfully committed the perfect crime and was now enjoying the game of misleading investigators. "The person we're looking for may have killed these children and then inserted themselves into the investigation as a grieving family member," Dr. Chin continued. "They're deriving satisfaction from watching investigators chase false leads while they remain above suspicion." But the darkest theory wasn't just about who might have killed Lilly and Jack Sullivan. It was about what might have happened to their bodies. The complete absence of remains despite extensive searching suggested several possibilities, all of them horrific. The children might have been buried in a location that investigators hadn't thought to search. They might have been disposed of in a way that made discovery unlikely, dissolved in acid, cremated, fed to animals. Or they might never have left the Sullivan property at all. Ground-penetrating radar was brought in to scan the area around the trailer. The results showed several anomalies in the soil, areas where the earth had been disturbed and then packed down again. When investigators dug in these locations, they found nothing but old septic system components and buried trash. But one anomaly was different. About 50 yards behind the trailer, in a small clearing that Daniel had claimed he was planning to use for a garden, the radar detected a void in the soil. Something had been buried there, and recently. The excavation was conducted with forensic archaeologists present, working with brushes and small tools to preserve any evidence they might find. News crews gathered at the perimeter, cameras ready to capture what everyone hoped and feared might be the end of the Sullivan mystery. What they found was even more disturbing than bodies would have been. Buried 3 feet down, wrapped in plastic bags, were the children's real pajamas, the ones they had actually been wearing when they disappeared. The clothes were stained with what appeared to be blood, and forensic analysis would later confirm it belonged to both children. But there were no bodies. Just the bloody clothes, buried like evidence that someone had tried to hide. The discovery of the buried pajamas marked a turning point in the investigation. This wasn't planted evidence meant to mislead investigators. This was real evidence that someone had tried to conceal, evidence that painted a picture of violence and cover-up. Someone had killed Lilly and Jack Sullivan, stripped their bodies of their bloody clothes, and buried the evidence in the backyard while conducting an elaborate charade of grief and cooperation with investigators. The question was no longer what had happened to the children. The question was who had killed them and what they had done with the bodies. As winter settled over Nova Scotia, investigators were preparing to make arrests. The evidence was circumstantial, but it was building into a compelling case against the people who should have protected Lilly and Jack Sullivan but instead had betrayed them in the most fundamental way possible. The truth about what happened on the morning of May 2nd, 2025, was finally emerging from the lies and misdirection that had obscured it for months. And that truth was darker than anyone had dared to imagine. December 15th, 2025. 7 months and 13 days after Lilly and Jack Sullivan walked out of their home and into the darkness of forever, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police finally said what everyone had been thinking but no one wanted to hear. Based on our investigation, Staff Sergeant Davidson announced at a packed press conference in Halifax, "We are now treating this as a homicide investigation. We believe that Lilly and Jack Sullivan are deceased, and we are actively investigating their deaths as potential murders." The words hung in the cold winter air like a death sentence for hope. The announcement came after weeks of intensive investigation following the discovery of the buried pajamas. DNA analysis had confirmed that the blood on the clothing belonged to both children, and the pattern of staining suggested they had suffered significant injuries before the clothes were removed. "We have evidence that these children were harmed," Davidson continued, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of terrible knowledge. "We have evidence that attempts were made to conceal that harm. And we have evidence that this investigation has been deliberately compromised by individuals who sought to mislead our efforts." The press conference marked the culmination of months of painstaking forensic work. Beyond the buried pajamas, investigators had uncovered a web of deception that painted a clear picture of premeditation and cover-up. Financial records showed that in the weeks before the children disappeared, someone in the Sullivan household had researched life insurance policies for children, specifically looking into whether stepchildren were covered under family plans. They weren't, but the searches suggested someone had hoped they were. Computer forensics revealed that the mysterious children's drawings sent to police and the family had been created using art software on the Sullivan home computer, then printed and artificially aged to look like authentic children's artwork. The metadata on the files showed they had been created after the children disappeared, not before. Most damning of all was cell phone data that contradicted key elements of both Caroline's and Daniel's alibis for the morning of May 2nd. Caroline's phone showed she had made several calls and sent text messages during the time she claimed to be outside feeding chickens, calls that would have been impossible to make from the chicken coop but could have been made from inside the trailer. Daniel's phone showed he had been actively using social media and browsing the internet during the time he claimed to be sleeping. The browsing history from that morning included searches for how long does it take to die from head injury and can cadaver dogs smell blood that's been cleaned up. We believe that what happened to Lilly and Jack Sullivan occurred inside their own home, Davidson announced. We believe it was not accidental, and we believe efforts were made to cover up their deaths and mislead our investigation. But the most shocking revelation came next. We are issuing arrest warrants for Caroline Michelle Sullivan and Daniel Robert Martel on charges of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and obstruction of justice in connection with the deaths of Lilly and Jack Sullivan. The courtroom erupted. Reporters shouted questions. Camera flashes lit up the room like lightning. Outside, protesters who had gathered to support the family stood in stunned silence as they processed what they had just heard. Both suspects had been cooperating with the investigation, even as they worked to sabotage it from within. Caroline had participated in search efforts while knowing her children were already dead. Daniel had sat through police interviews, feigning grief, while concealing the truth about what he had done. The arrest of Caroline Sullivan shocked the community more than Daniel's. A mother killing her own children was a betrayal so fundamental that many people simply refused to believe it was possible. But the evidence painted a clear picture of a woman who had chosen her relationship with Daniel over the safety of her children, and who had participated in their murders rather than lose the man she thought she loved. Phone records showed that in the days before the children disappeared, Caroline and Daniel had exchanged hundreds of text messages discussing their financial problems, their relationship issues, and their resentment of the responsibilities that came with caring for Lilly and Jack. "The kids are always in the way," read one message from Caroline to Daniel. "I wish things could just be simple between us." Daniel's response was even more chilling. "Maybe someday they will be." The text exchange occurred 3 days before the children vanished. Dr. Sarah Chin, the forensic psychologist, explained how such a horrific crime could have been committed by people who had once claimed to love the victims. "We see this in cases where adults prioritize their romantic relationship over their parental responsibilities," she said. "The children become obstacles to happiness rather than sources of joy. When that psychological shift occurs, when children are seen as problems to be solved rather than people to be protected, terrible things can happen." The arrests brought no relief to the community that had spent months searching for Lilly and Jack. If anything, the revelation that they had been killed by their own family members made the tragedy even more devastating. "We walked through those woods for weeks," said volunteer searcher Mark Thompson, tears streaming down his face. "We called their names until our voices were raw. And all the time, the people who killed them were right there with us, pretending to help, pretending to grieve." The $150,000 reward that had been offered for information leading to the children's safe return was quietly withdrawn. There would be no safe return. There had never been any possibility of a safe return because Lilly and Jack Sullivan had been dead from the very first day of the search. But even with arrests made and charges filed, one crucial question remained unanswered. Where were the bodies? Despite extensive searches of the Sullivan property and surrounding areas, despite ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs and forensic archaeology, the remains of Lilly and Jack Sullivan had never been found. The buried pajamas had been evidence of the crime, but they weren't the children themselves. Somewhere in Nova Scotia, 2 small bodies lay hidden, their final resting place known only to the people who had put them there. "Until we recover the remains," Davidson said at the conclusion of the press conference, "this investigation will continue. Lilly and Jack Sullivan deserve to be laid to rest with dignity. Their family and community deserve closure. And justice demands that we find them." The arrest warrants were executed that same evening. Caroline Sullivan was taken into custody at her sister's house in Halifax, where she had been staying since leaving the search area months earlier. She showed no emotion as handcuffs were placed on her wrists, no surprise at the charges being read to her. Daniel Martel was arrested at the Sullivan trailer, where he had continued living throughout the investigation, maintaining the fiction that he was a grieving stepfather waiting for his children to come home. Neighbors reported that he had seemed almost relieved when the police arrived, as if a weight had finally been lifted from his shoulders. Both suspects were denied bail, deemed flight risks and potential dangers to the community. They were scheduled to appear in court the following week for their first hearing on charges that could result in life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. But legal proceedings would have to wait. The most important work was still ahead, finding Lilly and Jack Sullivan and bringing them home. As 2025 drew to a close, the search for two missing children had become the hunt for two hidden graves. And somewhere in the cold Nova Scotia winter, their killers sat in separate jail cells, holding the secret of where they had hidden the evidence of their unthinkable crime. The case that had begun with hope and community solidarity was ending with betrayal and horror. But it wasn't over yet. The final chapter of the Sullivan tragedy was still being written, and it would only end when two small bodies were finally found and laid to rest. For now, Lilly and Jack Sullivan remained missing, their fate known but their final resting place still a mystery. Their story had become a cautionary tale about the dangers that can lurk within our own homes, perpetrated by the very people entrusted with protecting the innocent. And as winter settled over the search area, where hundreds of volunteers had once called their names, the silence in the woods seemed deeper than ever before. 2 years have passed since Lilly and Jack Sullivan walked out of their home for the last time. 2 years since a community came together in hope and was torn apart by unthinkable betrayal. 2 years since the search that was never really a search, because the people who knew where the children were had been standing right there among the searchers, accepting sympathy while concealing murder. Today, as I record this final chapter, Caroline Sullivan and Daniel Martel sit in separate maximum security facilities, awaiting trial for the first-degree murder of 2 innocent children. Their legal teams have entered pleas of not guilty, despite evidence that prosecutors call overwhelming and irrefutable. But even with confessions, even with guilty verdicts, even with life sentences, one crucial question may never be answered. Where are Lilly and Jack Sullivan? The bodies have never been found. Search efforts continue sporadically, led now by private investigators and volunteer organizations rather than official law enforcement. Ground-penetrating radar has scanned hundreds of acres. Cadaver dogs have followed countless false leads. Psychics, dowsers, and amateur investigators have all claimed to know where the children were buried. All have failed. The failure to locate the remains has become its own kind of torture for the extended family and the community that loved these children. Without bodies to bury, without graves to visit, without the closure that comes from laying the dead to rest, the grief remains suspended in time, unable to heal. It's like they're still missing, says Caroline's mother, Patricia, who has become the children's most vocal advocate. Even knowing they're gone, even knowing what happened to them, there's still this part of me that wonders if they're out there somewhere, waiting to come home. The psychological impact on the community has been profound. Parents who once let their children play outside unsupervised now watch them with constant vigilance. Trust, once freely given, has become a precious commodity. The idea that children can be killed by their own family members has shattered assumptions about safety that may never be rebuilt. Dr. Sarah Chin, the forensic psychologist who worked on the case, believes the failure to find the bodies is deliberate and calculating. Caroline and Daniel planned this crime carefully, she explains. They chose a disposal method that they believed would prevent discovery. The fact that extensive searches have failed suggests they put considerable thought into where and how they hid the evidence. The most likely scenarios, according to experts, are disturbing in their implications. The children may have been buried in a location far from their home, requiring transportation that left no trace. They may have been disposed of in water deep enough that recovery is impossible. Or they may have been destroyed entirely through cremation or dismemberment. Each possibility represents a level of premeditation and cruelty that defies comprehension. The case has had lasting impacts beyond the immediate tragedy. It has changed how missing children investigations are conducted, with law enforcement now more skeptical of family members who seem overly helpful or insert themselves too deeply into search efforts. It has highlighted the dangers of social media vigilantism, as the online mob that formed around the Sullivan case destroyed innocent lives while completely missing the real perpetrators who are hiding in plain sight. And it has raised disturbing questions about how many other missing children cases might involve family members who have successfully deceived investigators while maintaining public facades of grief and cooperation. The Sullivan case should serve as a warning, says retired RCMP investigator Tom Bradley. Not all missing children have wandered off. Not all families are telling the truth. And not all searches are genuine efforts to find the lost. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Sullivan case is how it demonstrates that evil can wear the mask of love, that killers can appear as grieving parents, that those entrusted with protecting children can become their destroyers. Lilly Sullivan was 7 years old when she died. She loved unicorns and drawing pictures with crooked smiles. She called her blanket Uni and carried a stick she pretended was a magic wand. She was learning to read and dreamed of becoming a veterinarian. Jack Sullivan was 4 years old when he died. He loved juice boxes and toy trucks. He followed his big sister everywhere and had just learned to tie his own shoes with help. He was afraid of the dark but brave when Lilly was with him. They were not just victims of a crime. They were not just statistics in a missing persons case. They were children with hopes and dreams and futures that were stolen from them by the very people who should have protected them with their lives. Their story deserves to be remembered not just as a cautionary tale about family violence or social media vigilantism, but as a reminder of the preciousness of childhood innocence and the sacred trust that exists between adults and the children in their care. Somewhere in Nova Scotia, 2 small bodies lie hidden in unmarked graves, waiting to be found by someone who hasn't given up looking for them. Until they are found, until they are brought home, until they are laid to rest with the dignity they deserve, their story remains unfinished. The search for Lilly and Jack Sullivan continues, 2 years after it began, driven now not by hope of finding them alive, but by the simple human need to bring them home. Their case stands as a reminder that some secrets are buried so deep they may never surface, and some mysteries may never be solved. But even in the darkness of this tragedy, there are lessons to be learned and truths to be acknowledged. Children must be protected, not just from strangers in the woods, but from the dangers that can lurk within their own homes. Communities must remain vigilant, not just for external threats but for the signs of abuse and neglect that too often go unnoticed. And investigators must be prepared to look beyond obvious explanations to find the uncomfortable truths that hide behind carefully constructed lies. The Sullivan case changed everything for those who lived it, the investigators who worked it, the volunteers who searched, the community that grieved. It challenged assumptions about family, safety, and trust that many thought were unshakable. As this story ends, 2 empty pairs of shoes still sit somewhere in an evidence locker, waiting to be reunited with the feet that will never fill them again. 2 children's voices have been silenced forever, their laughter just a memory, their dreams nothing but echoes in the wind. But their story lives on, a reminder of innocence lost and justice sought, of love betrayed and hope that refuses to die. Until Lilly and Jack Sullivan are found, until they are brought home, their case will remain open, their memory preserved, their truth still being told. Thank you for following Lilly and Jack's story to the end. If this case moved you, if it made you think about the children in your own life and the responsibility we all share to protect them, hit that like button and subscribe. We have more stories that deserve to be heard, more truths that need to be told. Share your thoughts, your feelings, and your final theories in the comments below. And remember that somewhere out there, 2 children are still waiting to come home. Their story may be over, but their search continues. Until they are found, until they rest in peace, until justice is truly served, we will not forget Lilly and Jack Sullivan. We will not stop looking. We will not let their memory fade into silence. Because every child deserves to be remembered. Every child deserves to be found. And every child deserves to come home.